The morning of December 15th, 1944, Chōfu Airfield, western Tokyo. Frost has crept across the aluminum skins of parked fighters, dulling the crimson hinomaru circles into pale pink. Mechanics in heavy coats pour hot water over engine cowlings to warm the frozen oil. The air smells of aviation fuel and wet earth. From the east, the faint thrum of engines, deep, rhythmic, and countless, begins to roll across the city like distant thunder. Second Lieutenant Masaru Itagaki of the 244th Sentai stands beside his Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien, the Swallow. Its slender fuselage gleams faintly beneath the grey winter sky. He adjusts his oxygen mask, the rubber stiff with cold. The morning briefing still echoes in his ears. Enemy formation sighted, approaching the Tokyo area from the south-southeast, altitude 30,000 feet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 30,000 feet. The number itself feels unreal. Their previous encounters with American bombers, B-24 Liberators, and B-17 Flying Fortresses had been fought at 20,000, perhaps 25,000 feet. Even that altitude left pilots short of breath, their liquid-cooled engines gasping in the thinning air. But 30,000, that was a height belonging to the stratosphere, a place for weather balloons and mountain winds, not dogfights. The ground controller's voice crackles through the radio. All interceptors scramble immediately. Maintain maximum climb rate. Do not wait for formation. Itagaki swings into the cockpit. The seatbelt buckle clicks shut over his thick flight suit. He feels the engine shudder alive beneath him, the Kawasaki Ha-40 inline engine, a Japanese-built version of Germany's Daimler-Benz DB601. The coolant temperature climbs. He opens the throttle, and the fighter lunges forward. The wheels leave the runway, retracting with a metallic groan. The nose points skyward. As Tokyo falls away beneath him, a pale sun rises through the winter haze. The radio fills with fragmented voices, other pilots calling altitude readings, engine temperatures, compass bearings. At 10,000 feet, the first layer of cloud swallows him. At 15,000, his breath begins to frost inside the mask. At 20,000, the engine starts to tremble, losing the crisp throttle response it had near the ground. He glances at the manifold pressure gauge. The needle quivers at the red line. Then he sees them. Thin white threads stretch across the upper sky contrails, tens of miles long, weaving and looping in a vast procession. Each line belongs to a four-engined giant, moving slowly but irresistibly toward the capital. The B-29 superfortress. Itagaki's first thought is disbelief. They are so high. Even through the haze, their formation gleams like silver insects drifting above the clouds. He pushes the throttle forward, coaxing the Ki-61 to climb harder. The climb rate falls away, from 2,500 feet per minute to 1,000 to barely 500. The altimeter creeps upward toward 28,000 feet. Beyond that, the engine coughs, the nose trembles. He can go no higher. His eyes narrow on the enemy formation, still distant, still far above. He squeezes the trigger, out of habit more than logic. The machine guns chatter, but the tracers arc upward and then fall away long before they reach the contrails. The shells vanish into empty sky. That morning, for the first time, Japanese pilots understood a terrible truth. It was not only their aircraft that could not reach the B-29 seconds, even their weapons could not. The winter of 1944 found Japan's air defense forces in a moment of desperate adaptation. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force had once believed its homeland invulnerable to large-scale air attack. The vast Pacific distances, the supposed limitations of American bombers, and the proud confidence born from early war victories all contributed to a belief that Japan's cities were beyond reach. Until the summer of 1944, that assumption had held. American heavy bombers operating from China, the B-24 and B-17, could strike at Kyushu only in token raids, their payloads reduced by range limitations. The Doolittle raid of 1942 had been seen as a stunt, not a strategic threat. But in June of 1944, the American capture of the Mariana Islands Saipan, Tinian, and Guam changed the geometry of the Pacific War. For the first time, the U.S. Army Air Forces possessed bases within 2,000 miles of Tokyo. That distance was precisely what the B-29 superfortress had been designed for. The superfortress represented not merely a new aircraft, but an entirely new category of warfare. Each B-29 carried 4 Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone radial engines, each producing over 2,000 horsepower, feeding massive turbo superchargers that maintained power at altitudes where most engines suffocated. The crew compartments were fully pressurized, a revolutionary feature allowing 10 men to work in relative comfort while flying higher than any previous bomber could sustain. At cruising altitude, 30,000 feet, the outside air temperature fell below -40 degrees. At such heights, the curvature of the Earth could be seen along the horizon. The bombers flew faster than most Japanese interceptors could climb, higher than most could reach, and beyond the effective ceiling of most anti-aircraft artillery. To Japanese radar operators, their contrails appeared as ghostly lines across the screens, white scratches in the upper atmosphere, beyond the reach of everything Japan possessed to oppose them. The Imperial Army's early response was to rely on existing interceptor units, primarily the Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien and the Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki. Both had been advanced designs when introduced in 1942, but by late 1944 they were already being outclassed. The Ki-61, powered by a liquid-cooled inline engine, offered good high-speed performance and a sleek aerodynamic profile, but its service ceiling on paper was around 32,000 feet. In practice, few aircraft could reach that altitude without severe loss of control and overheating. Japanese fuel quality had declined, reducing power output even further. The Ki-44 Shoki, nicknamed Tojo by Allied pilots, had a more powerful radial engine and an exceptional climb rate at lower altitudes. But it was also notoriously unstable at high altitude, with poor maneuverability and unreliable oxygen systems. Japanese doctrine up to that point had emphasized energy combat at medium altitude, intercepting bombers with high-speed passes or tight turning engagements. None of their training or tactics anticipated combat above 25,000 feet. The B-29 forced them into a new, alien kind of war, one fought in thin air, at temperatures where oil froze and bullets lost velocity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Itagaki levels off at 28,000 feet. The altimeter trembles. The airspeed needle wavers near 180 miles per hour. His gloves are stiff with cold. Ahead, he sees the faint dots of American bombers, dozens of them, their formation tight and orderly, their movement serene. He keys the transmitter. This is Blue 2. Altitude 28,000. Cannot climb further. Static answers him. The thin air distorts the radio waves. He catches fragments of other voices, men gasping through oxygen masks, cursing their engines, reporting overheating. Then, the first anti-aircraft bursts appear, far below the bombers' black puffs scattered like dust motes. The ground batteries are firing blindly, shells detonating thousands of feet too low. Itagaki realizes with a sick certainty that even the Army's 88mm guns cannot reach that high with accuracy. The bombers are untouchable. He watches as silver specks detach from the formation bombs falling silently, their paths curved by the jet stream winds that rip across the upper sky. He counts seconds until the first explosions rumble faintly through the air. Tokyo burns somewhere below the cloud cover. And yet, the bombers remain unscathed. No defensive fire is directed at him. He is simply too far away to matter. The distance between them is not measured in meters but in technology, a gulf of engineering that no act of bravery can close. When the American formation turns eastward, the Japanese fighters circle helplessly, their engines overheating, their ammunition unfired. One by one, they peel off, diving back toward the earth. Itagaki's descent feels like a surrender. The controls grow firm again as the air thickens, the temperature rises, the engine sound stabilizes. He lands with his fuel nearly exhausted. The maintenance crew approaches, their faces puzzled. "Did you engage?" one asks. He removes his oxygen mask slowly. "No," he says. "They were above everything." The shock of those first high-altitude raids spread rapidly through Japan's air defense hierarchy. Reports from units across Honshu repeated the same pattern. B-29 formations cruising at 27 to 31,000 feet, Japanese fighters stalling below them, anti-aircraft shells bursting thousands of feet too low. Between November and December of 1944, the 10th Hikoshidan Air Division filed dozens of after-action reports to Army headquarters in Tachikawa, all describing the same problem: altitude. The American bombers flew not only beyond reach, but beyond the conceptual framework of Japanese air defense. For years, Japan's fighter development had focused on agility and climb attributes, born from early Pacific War experience against lightly armored American and British aircraft. Weight was the enemy. Every kilogram of armor or equipment reduced maneuverability. Radios were sometimes removed to save weight. Pilots were trained to value precision flying and coordinated turns above all else. But the B-29 rendered those virtues meaningless. No amount of maneuverability could compensate for a 4,000-foot altitude disadvantage. The problem was not tactical, but physical. Japanese engineers scrambled to modify existing aircraft. Superchargers were hastily redesigned. New models such as the Kawasaki Ki-100 and Nakajima Ki-84 were rushed into production with more powerful engines, but they would arrive too late and in too few numbers. Meanwhile, fuel shortages and airfield bombings crippled flight training. As the winter deepened, American raids increased. Each one reinforced the same grim conclusion. Japan's defenders were fighting a war their aircraft had not been built to fight. The irony was profound. In the early years of the war, Japanese aviation had embodied innovation and performance beyond the reach of the Allies. The Zero had redefined air combat, combining range, agility, and climb into a weapon of dominance. But by 1944, those very design philosophies, the pursuit of lightness and simplicity, had become fatal weaknesses. Against the B-29, strength, power, and altitude mattered more than grace. The future belonged to machines that could fly through the stratosphere, not dance below the clouds. That night, as the fires of Tokyo glowed red on the horizon, Lieutenant Itagaki wrote in his flight log, "We climbed until the engines could no longer breathe. The enemy remained above us, as if in another world. Our bullets fell short before reaching them. They did not even see us." In those few lines lies the moment Japan's pilots realized the war in the air was already lost, not through courage or lack of it, but through physics itself. The new year of 1945 dawned beneath a cold, clear sky. Across Japan's airfields at Chōfu, Tachikawa, Hamamatsu, and Ashiya, the frost lay thick on the wings of aircraft that had begun to feel obsolete even before their engines turned. The B-29 seconds came now with numbing regularity, crossing the coast in waves that no longer inspired alarm, only resignation. Each contrail over Tokyo told a story of a nation defending itself with courage that technology could no longer support. To the senior staff of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, the evidence was now undeniable. Reports from late December had detailed catastrophic failures, oxygen systems freezing solid, machine gun rounds losing ballistic stability in thin air, superchargers cracking from thermal stress. Engineers at the Tachikawa arsenal tested the 12.7mm Ho 103 machine gun and found that its rounds lost striking power beyond 27,000 feet. At 30,000, even direct hits often failed to penetrate a B-29's pressurized skin. The 20mm Ho 5 cannon performed little better. Its shells slowed so dramatically that the fuses sometimes failed to arm before impact. The Americans, meanwhile, had adapted their strategy with mathematical precision. Each bomber formation was a moving fortress, coordinated through an analog fire control computer that allowed a single gunner to direct multiple turrets. The system tracked target speed and angle automatically, compensating for air density and bullet drop. At altitude, where Japanese weapons grew erratic, American defensive fire remained geometrically perfect. For Japanese pilots, the experience of interception had become an act of ritual defiance. Climb, stall, dive away, repeat. Few saw their targets close enough to distinguish. Markings. At Tachikawa, Colonel Teruhiko Kobayashi, only 22 years old, commander of the elite 244th Sentai, gathered his exhausted pilots in a drafty hangar for an afternoon briefing. A captured photograph of a B-29 was pinned to the wall. Its size dominated the image, wings spanning 141 feet, nearly double the width of a Ki-61. Kobayashi tapped the picture with a gloved finger. "This," he said quietly, "is what we face. Courage alone will not bring them down." He was right. Even when Japanese fighters managed to reach the bombers, their guns could not do enough damage before energy ran out. The Hien's two 12.7mm and two 20mm weapons could shred a Zero or a B-24, but the superfortress absorbed punishment like a battleship. Crews returning to Tinian recorded bullet impacts in the hundreds. Few attacks resulted in catastrophic failure. The pressurized cabins prevented decompression even when punctured repeatedly. Desperation bred innovation. Technicians began stripping weight from the fighters, removing radios, armor plates, even paint. Engines were tuned to dangerous boost levels. Still, climb performance improved only marginally. Some squadrons adopted a new tactic, attacking from below using timed climbs and firing at steep angles, hoping to strike the bomb bays. But the geometry was hopeless at 30,000 feet. Even a few degrees of misjudgment meant shells fell harmlessly behind. By January of 1945, headquarters authorized a drastic shift. Interception units were to prepare for Tayatari deliberate collision attacks, not suicide in name, but in effect. If guns could not reach, perhaps the aircraft themselves could. Kobayashi opposed the order, arguing that trained pilots were more valuable alive, but the logic of despair prevailed. Records from the 47th Sentai at Narimasu show that pilots were briefed to aim for the wings or tail of B-29 seconds, using their propeller arcs as cutting blades. Many never returned. The Americans noticed. Gun camera footage from the 21st Bomber Command's February raids over Nagoya shows single Japanese fighters diving vertically through the formation, wings tearing away under the stress before they struck. Most missed. Some exploded prematurely when fuel ignited from tracer hits. But a few succeeded, shearing control surfaces or igniting engines. For the crews inside those bombers, the ramming attacks were the most terrifying encounters of the entire air war. Yet, statistically, the effect was negligible. Of more than 800 B-29 seconds dispatched against Japan that February, fewer than a dozen were lost to ramming. The majority of Japanese fighters never reached their targets. The gulf remained. As these sacrifices mounted, technical officers searched for mechanical salvation. In underground workshops around Tachikawa and Gifu, engineers worked feverishly on modified interceptors. The Kawasaki Ki-100 replaced the unreliable Ha-40 inline engine with a powerful Ha-112II radial. In testing, it climbed better and performed at altitude with surprising stability, but production began only in March, by which time fuel shortages restricted pilot training to minutes per flight. Another project, the Ki-109, sought to mount a 75mm anti-tank cannon in the nose of a two-seat bomber, turning it into a giant gun platform. It could, in theory, destroy a B-29 with a single hit if it could ever reach one. None of the prototypes ever fired in combat. The aircraft's ceiling barely exceeded 25,000 feet. The irony deepened. Japan's engineers understood the problem precisely, but lacked the industrial foundation to solve it. Turbo superchargers required alloys and precision machining that wartime shortages made impossible. American industry produced them by the tens of thousands. Japan could barely assemble a dozen functional units. The pilots in the sky were paying the price for the collapse of the factories below. In March of 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command. The B-29 seconds were now so secure at altitude that their own commander changed tactics not out of fear, but efficiency. LeMay realized that the thin air at 30,000 feet scattered bombs unpredictably, the jet stream tearing formations apart. He ordered the bombers to descend to less than 10,000 feet, trading altitude for accuracy. It was a grim testament to American confidence. The skies above Japan were now so empty of defenders that the bombers could safely fly at altitudes once suicidal. When the first low-level incendiary raid struck Tokyo on the night of March 9th, no Japanese fighter rose to intercept. Pilots had no fuel. Airfields lay cratered from previous attacks. Anti-aircraft batteries lacked ammunition. The city burned beneath a firestorm that consumed 16 square miles and killed over 100,000 people in a single night. From their shattered airfields, the surviving pilots watched orange light blooming across the horizon. For men like Itagaki and Kobayashi, who had once believed their homeland invulnerable, the sight was both awe and despair. They had trained to fight machines. Now they were witnessing the destruction of an entire civilization from the sky. After the firebombing, the last months of the air war became an echo of defeat. The interceptors still scrambled, but only symbolically. Many took off, knowing they had barely enough fuel to climb once and glide home. Ground crews scavenged metal from wrecked aircraft to patch others. Oxygen systems were rationed. Some pilots flew without them, losing consciousness in thin air before reaching the bombers. And still, they flew. In Kobayashi received orders to prepare a special attack section within the 244th Sentai. The men volunteered without hesitation. On the 14th, during an American daylight raid, he personally rammed a B-29 over Tokyo, severing its tail before parachuting from his destroyed aircraft. He survived with minor injuries. The American bomber did not. His action was celebrated across Japan as proof that courage could still wound the enemy. But Kobayashi knew better. One success, he wrote later, does not change the sky. The sky belongs to them. By summer, the American campaign reached totality. Mining operations choked Japan's harbors. Refineries burned. The few remaining fighters sat grounded for lack of high-octane fuel. On clear days, children in Tokyo could see the contrails of passing B-29 seconds without a single Japanese aircraft climbing to meet them. The war in the air had become entirely one-sided. When the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, it was delivered by a B-29 named Enola Gay. The aircraft cruised at 31,000 feet, the same unreachable altitude that had haunted Japanese pilots for nearly a year. No interceptor challenged it. None could. The weapon it carried ended the war, but the outcome had already been decided in those frozen upper layers of air months before. In the post-war years, a few surviving Japanese pilots recorded their memories for history. Many spoke not of hatred or revenge, but of awe. They described the B-29 as something beyond comprehension, a machine that belonged to a different age. One recalled the first time he saw the silver bombers gleaming above the clouds. They were so high that sunlight touched them while we flew in shadow. It felt like trying to shoot at the sun. Historians later calculated the imbalance in numbers. Between November 1944 and August 1945, the B-29 campaign dropped nearly 160,000 tons of bombs on Japan. Japanese fighters destroyed only 74 bombers in air-to-air combat, a kill ratio worse than 20-1. The rest returned safely to the Marianas, rearmed, and came again. For Japan's aviators, the experience marked the collapse of a worldview built on mastery of flight. The early war ideal of the pilot, as samurai skill conquering machinery, had perished in the upper atmosphere over Tokyo. The war's final irony was that the same faith in lightness and agility that had once given Japan supremacy in the skies now left it defenseless before the heavy, armored, oxygen-fed future of American industry. In the final pages of his post-war memoir, Teruhiko Kobayashi reflected on those months. At 30,000 feet, we discovered the limits not of courage, but of invention. The men who built those bombers had conquered the air itself. They had learned to breathe where we could not. When our bullets fell back to earth, we understood that the war was already lost, even before the bombs reached the ground. That sentence captures the essence of the story. The B-29's altitude was more than a technical advantage. It was a symbol of the industrial, scientific, and psychological distance between two nations. The Japanese pilots who strained their engines skyward toward invisible enemies were witnessing the transformation of warfare, from human skill to mechanical supremacy. In the cold, thin air above Tokyo, courage froze before it could burn, the guns could not reach, and the world, for the first time, belonged to those who could build machines that touched the edge of space. When the fighting ended in August 1945, Japan's surviving pilots returned to airfields that no longer had aircraft. Hangars stood roofless, runways cracked, engines cannibalized for scrap. The silence after surrender was almost unbearable. For men who had lived in the roar of engines and the thin air above 30,000 feet, the quiet of peace sounded like absence itself. Many expected to face Allied tribunals or public disgrace. Instead, they were ordered to assist the occupation authorities in cataloguing Japan's remaining aircraft. In the hangars of Chōfu, Hamamatsu, and Kagamigahara, engineers and American technical officers examined what was left of the Japanese aviation industry. The contrast was stark. The airframes were elegant but fragile, the engines refined but unreliable, the instruments simple to the point of austerity. When the Americans compared the surviving Ki-61 seconds and Ki-84 seconds to their own P-51 Mustangs, or B-29 superfortresses, the gap seemed to stretch decades rather than years. Turbo superchargers, hydraulic systems, self-sealing tanks, the very features Japan had once dismissed as wasteful luxury, were now recognized as the essential organs of modern flight. Colonel Teruhiko Kobayashi, still in his 20s, served briefly as a liaison to the American evaluation teams. He stood beside captured B-29 seconds at Yokota Air Base, walking through their pressurized cabins with a notebook in hand. The precision impressed him. The oxygen regulators that never froze, the cabin heaters that worked flawlessly at altitude, the analog fire control computers that could track targets invisible to the naked eye. Later, in a quiet moment, he told an interpreter, "It was not that we lacked bravery. We lacked the machinery to make bravery useful." That observation became a private mantra among Japan's former aviators. They had been raised on the belief that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that the quality of the man outweighed the quantity of the machine. But the B-29 proved otherwise. No amount of willpower could raise the ceiling of an engine starving for oxygen. During the American occupation, hundreds of Japanese engineers were questioned about their wartime work. The interrogations were methodical but respectful. Many Americans expressed admiration for Japanese craftsmanship, the meticulous assembly, the aerodynamic grace of designs like the Zero or the Shoki. Yet they also noted the fatal rigidity of Japan's engineering philosophy. Innovation had meant refining the light fighter, not reimagining the battlefield. The post-war reports compiled by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, published in 1946, devoted an entire chapter to the altitude problem. The conclusion was blunt. Japanese aircraft and anti-aircraft weapons were generally incapable of effective operation above 28,000 feet. The B-29 thus operated in a zone of practical immunity. That phrase, practical immunity, haunted Japanese pilots who read the translated reports. It described not merely a technical disparity, but a psychological one. Their defeat had been scientific, systematic, and unavoidable. For men trained to believe that courage defined victory, such an admission was more painful than the surrender itself. In the following years, the veterans found new lives in a country rebuilding from ashes. Many worked in factories that once produced aircraft components, now making sewing machines, bicycles, and small engines for a civilian economy. Others joined the newly created Japan Air Self-Defense Force in the 1950s, flying American-made jets under a different flag. When they first stepped into pressurized cockpits of the F-86 Sabre, they felt the air thicken again around old memories. The Sabre could climb effortlessly to 40,000 feet, where the B-29 seconds had once cruised untouchable. The irony was not lost on them. The very altitudes that had once symbolized defeat were now routine training zones. Technology had finally caught up with the sky that had been denied to them. Public memory, however, remained conflicted. In the post-war years, Japan's culture of remembrance focused more on the tragedy of the cities than on the men who tried to defend them. The B-29 raids became symbols of civilian suffering. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, all burned under their wings. The pilots who had climbed toward those bombers were largely forgotten, their efforts subsumed into the Blaison's larger narrative of devastation. Only in the 1960s did historians begin to record their testimonies in detail. The interviews reveal no bitterness. Instead, there is an almost scientific curiosity about how far the limits of flight could be pushed by human endurance alone. Lieutenant Masaru Itagaki, the young pilot who had first fired his guns into empty sky that December morning, told an interviewer, "I remember watching the tracers vanish before they reached the bombers. It was the first time I realized that physics could decide honor. The legacy of those high-altitude battles extended beyond Japan. For the United States, the B-29 campaign became a template for the next era of warfare, a demonstration that altitude, range, and technology could render traditional defenses obsolete. Within 5 years, jet bombers would replace propellers, and by 1952 the B-52 Stratofortress would take the concept even higher, capable of cruising at 45,000 feet. What began as a tactical advantage in 1944 evolved into a strategic doctrine. Command of the stratosphere equaled command of the battlefield. The skies above Tokyo had been a proving ground for that truth. For Japan, the psychological transformation was equally profound. The war taught its engineers that innovation must be continuous, that mastery of technology demanded humility before material science. The companies that rose from the ashes of the aviation industry, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Nakajima Aircraft, now Fuji Heavy Industries and Subaru, Kawasaki Aerospace, all redirected their wartime experience toward peaceful engineering. Their post-war products, from automobiles to high-speed trains, carried an unspoken inheritance, the pursuit of reliability in the face of impossible odds. In 1989, on the 45th anniversary of the first B-29 raid, a small memorial service was held at the former Chōfu Airfield. The runways were gone, replaced by suburban housing and a municipal park. A handful of surviving pilots attended, joined by American veterans who had flown from the Marianas. They spoke through interpreters but shared the same weathered expressions, men who had outlived the machines that once defined them. When the time came to offer incense, an American navigator stepped forward, followed by a Japanese pilot. Together they placed a small wreath beneath a plaque inscribed simply. No speeches followed. The wind across the field carried the sound of distant airliners climbing into the modern sky, contrails streaking white against blue. The altitude was the same 30,000 feet, but the meaning had changed. What had once been a barrier of death had become a highway of peace. The historian Saburo Ienaga later wrote that the B-29 campaign ended not only Japan's war, but an entire way of thinking about war. He meant that the confrontation between the B-29 and Japan's interceptors revealed a turning point in human warfare, the moment when industrial scale, scientific research, and engineering discipline surpassed the valor of individuals. The samurai ideal, reborn in the cockpit of the Zero, died somewhere between 28 and 31,000 feet above Tokyo. And yet, within that loss was also a strange kind of redemption. The pilots who faced the unreachable bombers came to embody a universal truth, that courage is measured not by success, but by persistence against impossibility. Their engines froze, their guns fell silent, their missions failed, but they climbed anyway. In one of his last interviews before his death in 1997, Teruhiko Kobayashi was asked what he felt when he looked at modern jets streaking overhead. He smiled and said, "They fly where we could not. That means we learned something." Becomes education. The men who could not reach the bombers nonetheless reached an understanding that would shape Japan's future, that progress is not born from faith alone, but from the humility to confront one's limits and surpass them through knowledge. Above the quiet suburbs where Chōfu once stood, passenger jets now trace their routes toward the Pacific. At 30,000 feet, the the same altitude that once defined despair, travelers sip tea and look down at the cloud tops. The air is still thin, the temperature still lethal, but life continues there serene, ordinary, unconcerned. The ghosts of the old pilots might look upward and recognize the altitude, if not the purpose. They would know that the sky, once divided by war, has become shared space again. And in that long arc, from 1944 to the present, from the roar of the superfortress to the hum of the airliner, lies the quiet resolution of their story. The world learned to breathe where they could not. Up. Next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.